It's my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Rosner. She's here today to speak about her most recent book, Survivor Café, The Legacy of Trauma and the Labyrinth of Memory. It grapples with intricate and possibly unanswerable questions about how we recognize and cope with the traumas we inherit, and how we can properly keep alive the personal stories behind great historical atrocities, even after everyone who lived through them is gone. In her focus on Holocaust survivors, Rosner uses the lens of her 3 visits to Germany with her father, who was born in Hamburg and imprisoned in Buchenwald concentration camp. The book also investigates the multi-generational aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Cambodian killing fields, the legacies of slavery, and other historical atrocities. I could read from any one of dozens of endorsements for this book, but I'll choose one from the San Francisco Chronicle, which named Survivor Café one of the 100 best books of 2017. Survivor Café feels like the book Rosner was born to write. Each page is imbued with urgency, with sincerity, with heartache, with heart. Her words, alongside the words of other survivors of atrocity and their descendants across the globe, can help us build a more humane world. Prior to Survivor Café, Elizabeth published 3 best-selling novels, the first of which, The Speed of Light, was internationally acclaimed and translated into 9 languages. Its central theme addresses the effects of the Holocaust on the descendants of survivors. A graduate of Stanford, UC Irvine, and the University of Queensland in Australia, Elizabeth is also my aunt. I had the opportunity to accompany her on the 3rd of the trips to Germany with my grandfather, after which she started putting pen to paper on Survivor Café. Without further ado, Elizabeth Rosner.
Thank you, Ezra. You forgot to introduce yourself. That was Ezra Bretler, my nephew, an employee of Google. It's great to be here. Thank you for coming. Thank you for spending lunchtime with me. My hope today is that I will share with you some of what I think of as the highlights of what I learned while writing this book. It's a blending of the personal narrative, as Ezra mentioned, my role in life, in a way, as a daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. Please help yourselves to books as you come in, there for you. And that then led me to reaching into a wider research-based approach to other lineages that seem to carry residue from historical trauma. And Ezra mentioned a few of them. I'll touch on some of them in my talk. And I also am going to share with you some things that we are learning in the realm of science about measurable, evidence-based studies showing that trauma actually modifies the expression of DNA. And that what we have long known as anecdotally, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of people who have endured war and genocide and other acts of violence, that residue seems to pervade subsequent generations. Scientists in the field of genetics, a new field actually called epigenetics, is starting to show that this is not something we're just imagining, that it's actually present and measurable. Then I'm going to touch on some of the impacts of memory studies and the ways that we memorialize the past that also relate to how not just personal inheritance of trauma, but the collective inheritance of trauma can be addressed in terms of culture, in terms of shared memory, and ultimately in the hope of healing and transforming some of those legacies into something more hopeful. And in order, we hope, not to continue to repeat a lot of the atrocities of the past. So to start with, a little bit about me. I grew up in upstate New York. Both of my parents, as I mentioned, were Holocaust survivors. My mother was in the Vilna ghetto, which you may be familiar with historically, and then she survived the war in hiding with her parents in the Polish countryside as a young teenager. My father, as you also heard, was imprisoned in the Buchenwald concentration camp at the age of 15. And the camp was liberated just after he turned 16 years old. My parents ended up meeting as refugees in Sweden, getting married in Israel, and then coming to America. And by the time I was born, on the very last day of the 50s, It was as though I were being born into the other life that my parents had created, their American selves, their reinvented selves. And yet I really did feel as though something had been transmitted to me in utero. And for a long time, people like me, children of Holocaust survivors, were told that we were being hysterical or too sensitive about feeling as though our emotional landscape, our psychological landscape was so impacted by something that didn't happen to us. But in fact, as I mentioned, we are starting to recognize that this is a real phenomenon. So I became a writer partly because I kept on wanting to ask questions. You've probably heard that writers are encouraged to write what they know. Well, in my case, I wanted to write what I wanted to know. So writing for me has always been an act of curiosity and inquiry and investigation. And this book, even though it comes after 3 novels and a poetry collection, in many ways really does feel like the book that contains all of the questions I've been asking all of my life. What is it that I carry that happened before I was born? How does that not differentiate me from others, but actually make me feel even more connected to others? When I was growing up, I often felt like I was markedly different from my peers. A lot of the Americans in my hometown had been there for generations. I was a first-generation American, as was my older sister and my younger brother. So we had something in common with each other, and our small kind of tribe, my parents' friends, a lot of them were also survivors of the Holocaust in Europe. But in the larger sense, I didn't feel like I was much like my peers. And so over time, I started to recognize that the more I looked into what I felt made me so unusual, that I felt so sensitive to, let's say, anxieties or preparing for catastrophe, or there were some friends of mine I know whose parents also survived going into exile from the Holocaust. They always kept a suitcase packed, just in case. Things like that that we considered normal. Most of our friends thought that was a little bizarre, a little paranoid maybe, or a little overreactive, oversensitive. And yet over time, I became more and more clear that in fact, subsequent generations of Japanese who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki actually have some similar behavior patterns and thought patterns. So do the descendants of African-American slaves in the United States. So do refugees from Cambodia who survived the killing fields in Cambodia. And unfortunately, the list does go on. It's a big list. And in the book, I don't cover every atrocity because, in fact, the more research I did, the more I realized that even in the news, as I was writing the book, new atrocities were taking place. So I don't, for example, include what's happening to the Rohingya in Myanmar, even though that is, in this moment, a genocide unfolding before our eyes. So the conversation is a big one. And what I'm trying to do is allow you some intimate access to a personal story and then see how you might find your own connection to that story, even if you don't necessarily recognize any of the places I've referred to. But your own family lineage is probably inscribed with something that does then pass through you intergenerationally. I'm going to read you a passage from one of the psychiatrists that I cite in my book who specializes in inherited trauma. She works with families whose children seem to be exhibiting signs of PTSD even when the children themselves have not been traumatized. And this is the great mystery that we've been trying to understand. How is it that you can look at somebody who grew up seemingly in a safe and protected environment still be displaying signs of PTSD? So I'm going to read you her definition of how this PTSD shows up. Unresolved trauma takes 2 different forms. The first is dissociation, where the trauma is blocked. There are no words. not only pushed away, but insecurely pushed away. And just to explain about that a little bit, so this kind of numbing effect, this way of sort of not being present in the moment is for some people a form of PTSD. An inability to manage their emotions is so overwhelming that they just shut down completely emotionally. The second way, the opposite way, is where the trauma is uncontainable, overflowing. Interactions are overflowing with emotion. The person mixes past and present. The trauma intrudes in places it doesn't belong. And that's the sentence I really want to focus on. The trauma intrudes on places it doesn't belong. It's sometimes defined as people's inability to feel safe in a safe environment. So you may know someone or have witnessed someone or experienced it yourself sitting in a perfectly quiet place, out in nature perhaps, where everything seems to be completely tranquil and unthreatening, and yet your heart is racing, your pulse is going mad, you might break out in a sweat. These are signs that internally you're experiencing not what the present moment is offering up, but some associative experience that makes you feel as though you're not in the present. You're actually in some other past, maybe experiencing things that were handed to you by parents or even grandparents. So I'm going to try to define epigenetics for you briefly, and to say, first of all, that I'm not a scientist. And so sometimes people object to the concept of epigenetics as though they want to take issue with it. And you're welcome to look it up and do your own research. I'm not the person who has done the research. I'm citing the research. So it began with mice. Emory University in Atlanta, a group of geneticists took some pre-adolescent mice and exposed them to the scent of cherry blossom, which is a chemical compound, and an electroshock. So the mice quickly learned to associate that scent with fear, panic, and pain. So even when the shock was no longer present, they would get extremely agitated. When these mice produced offspring, now remember they were pre-adolescent, so none of these mice was pregnant, there were no baby mice in utero. 3 and 4 generations of mice later, when those mice were exposed to cherry blossom for the first time, they panicked. They acted as if they already knew the associative pain that they might receive. They'd never witnessed their ancestor mice being exposed to the scent or the shock. So these researchers concluded that something had shifted in the DNA that was being passed to them. Now, the DNA itself wasn't necessarily being modified. It was epigenetically, meaning something on top of the DNA and the gene was being modified, and they call that the expression of the gene. Sometimes cortisol levels, which are associated with stress, hormone that we produce to help us respond to stress, was either suppressed or exaggerated. At the same time that those studies with mice were going on, there were researchers in Israel looking at Holocaust survivor families and noticing something similar, that grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were coming in for therapy with symptoms of PTSD for trauma that they themselves had not lived through. And so they started to connect the dots between these studies. And the studies are small. Humans don't reproduce as quickly as mice. So we don't know yet how residual, how long-lasting these effects are, but notable enough for people to raise questions and encourage more studies to be done to look into this. So it turns out that, for example, Cambodian refugees living in the United States are coming into therapeutic contexts with about a 95% rate of PTSD in the community. Off the charts high. In Cambodia, it's estimated somewhere between 1 out of 4 and 1 out of every 3 Cambodians was murdered by the Khmer Rouge. monumental portions of the population were impacted, not only by the losses, but by the fear associated with those losses, the reign of terror that lasted for the years the Khmer Rouge were in power. And you can sort of do the math yourself. These numbers need to be looked at. So what's happening in the United States right now, I think, is pretty strong evidence that we have unresolved trauma throughout the country. We have unresolved legacies of racism, slavery, Jim Crow laws, you name it, lynching. The aftermath of lynching in a community has never fully been addressed. And we are seeing what it looks like when we don't address trauma, when we don't address the residue of trauma. In Japan, they also have similar investigations into these lineages of the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who, for example, were often completely silent on the subject. Their radiation exposure was so severe that they feared that if their children were known to be the offspring of people who had been exposed to radiation, no one would want to marry them because of fear of birth defects. So there was a long history of silence about the effects of those bombs and the fallout, the literal fallout. We use fallout now as a metaphor, but it was literal. It still is literal. So a lot of what I'm talking about in my book is actually this interconnection between literal residue, literal lasting radioactivity in the body, and what that means metaphorically, that we do carry the effects of what happened to our ancestors and our cultural companions, our compatriots. So what that leads me then to consider is, how do we do this memory together? How do we remember not just what happened in my family, for example? My nephew introduced this story of 3 different trips I took to Germany with my father. One in 1983, one in 1995, and the third in 2015. So in 1983, I was in my 20s, my father was in his 50s, and Germany was still divided. So when we went first to Hamburg, then to Berlin to pass through Checkpoint Charlie to get permission to enter into East Germany and visit the site of the camp, what we were facing was a culture, a country that was choosing to remember the past in a particular way. Their historical version of what had happened in World War II focused primarily on the victory for them of communism over fascism. When we tried to visit the site of the concentration camp, we were directed away from the camp itself to a monument located a couple of kilometers away that had victorious communist statues celebrating their victory over the fascists. Jews were not part of the conversation. So my father and I did find our way to the site of the camp. There was nobody there. We were the only 2 people there. It was this vast, barren field of gravel, still surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but nobody inside them. So that was my first experience of feeling the presence of those ghosts, and the fact that I could share this with my father in such a way that literally, we both heard in the wind the sound of people screaming at the same time. And for me, that was a palpable sense in my body that something my father had lived through was really passing into my body. And at the end of that trip, he said, "I want to come back with the rest of the family." I had begun writing about, I was becoming a writer, and of course my material seemed so obvious. My family's story was my material. So flash forward 12 years later to 1995, and now my siblings and I, my mother and my father, are all going to the reunified Germany together. And Buchenwald is now the center of a commemoration site. It was being celebrated with a feast, a banquet, on the site of the concentration camp, a completely surreal event that I write about in the book. I felt like Fellini had filmed this. It was just bizarre, a giant tent on the site of this place where so many people were starved and worked to death and murdered. And right in the middle of the meal, one of my father's front teeth fell out. And suddenly he looked, have you ever seen someone with a missing front tooth? You know, this hole suddenly appearing in his smile and his face. And I was remembering in that experience that when we had been there in 1983 together, he passed a kidney stone while we were there. So you can see how the body has its own way of remembering trauma and re-experiencing, revisiting trauma. So now the context was Germany was reunified. They were trying to reorganize their memory, literally, of how they were remembering what had happened during World War II. 20 years later, 2015, my nephew and I and my father are all in the same place. Now we're 3 generations together. And we are being echoed and met by 3 generations of Germans, especially the grandchildren who call themselves, like the Jewish, compartment of generation of survivors, 3rd generation. They call themselves 3G. That's how I found out I was 2G, because my 3G nephew explained to me that I was now a member of this 2nd generation. The grandchildren of the survivors and the grandchildren of the Nazis were now taking it upon themselves to remember together what had happened. So there was this remarkable bridge across the great divide of history to say it's our obligation to remember this together and to look at our counterparts as fellow travelers through this journey of what part of the past is still impacting us now in the present. In Japan, something similar is happening. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd generation survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are also asking themselves, how do we keep this memory alive? And I mentioned a little while ago that this memory is both personal and collective, even if you're not personally related to the survivors. How do we all carry this in a shared way? And in Japan, there's a remarkable role being taken on by people who call themselves denshosha, which is translated as the designated transmitter of memory. And the denshosha are memorizing the stories of the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki so that they can tell the story when the firsthand experience is no longer available in person. They are literally choosing to embody the story and humanize it, keep it individual and meaningful in that way. So what are some other parallels for that? Well, in South Africa, you probably know, after apartheid ended, Mandela and others created something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they chose to coordinate the remembering of the past, not in a legal, punishing format, but in a way of creating dialogue and conversation, allowing the victims of apartheid to speak to the perpetrators and be heard, simply have their stories be told as the truth. Because one of the first things that goes in war and atrocity and genocide is truth itself. The facts, I'm afraid we're witnessing a lot of this right now in our culture when facts are becoming distorted and the truth seems blurry at the edges, blurry at best. So in Rwanda, where there was also a horrific genocide in the late 1990s, when 800,000 Tutsis were murdered by their Hutu neighbors with machetes in 4 months, 800,000 people murdered in a period of 4 months. Now the Rwandan government is trying to help the remaining Hutus and the remaining Tutsis work together to rebuild the country as neighbors. They were neighbors before the genocide. They are neighbors again. How does this work? How can you bring victims and perpetrators together in a way that isn't re-traumatizing Well, it's complicated. When I was revising Survivor Café, every time I wrote about something like this, I would go back over the book again and again. My last time to reread it, I looked for the word complicated. I did a word search for complicated. It showed up 49 times. I had to go back through and really consider the nuances of that word, but everything I was talking about was indeed complicated. The complication of how many generations past slavery in America are we, and yet we are still bearing witness to the unresolved trauma that it left behind. Bryan Stevenson, who is an African-American lawyer who used to be with the Southern Poverty Law Center and started something called the Equal Justice Initiative, has been determined to create monuments in every location where a lynching took place. In Europe, something similar had been done, is being done. An artist put down what he called Stolpersteine, stumbling stones, replacing individual cobblestones with gilded over stones stamped with the name of a person who was murdered. And they say, here lived this person's name, this person's birth date, and died in Auschwitz, Treblinka, Ravensbrück, Majdanek, the names of camps, the names of maybe unknown locations. So Bryan Stevenson said, the power of standing on a spot where you know an atrocity took place has to be replicated in the United States, where these lynching sites were. Thousands of people witnessed lynchings in America. It wasn't just the horrific violence done to the individual. There was an act of violence committed in full view of often the entire town. So how do we remember that in a way that honors the victim and tells the truth about what happened? So plaques are being placed in locations where lynchings took place, and a big museum in Montgomery is being built with soil from each of those places to be held in jars and vessels to say, we are all connected by this earth that we stand on. So even though I might be tempted to say, my ancestors weren't slave owners, I'm a first-generation American, I don't have to take responsibility for the residue of this trauma. Simply by being an American standing on American soil, I do have to take responsibility for what happened in this country, and that I'm the beneficiary of a lot of things that we all benefited from during slavery and all of the inhuman violence committed against post-slavery Americans. So how do we remember well? How do we work carefully to preserve this memory and to keep it personal, as I said, and also to keep it alive once the witnesses and the people who enacted those crimes or were the victims of those crimes are no longer here to remind us of the human experience? So I don't know how many of you have ever been to Washington, D.C., the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and also the very recently completed African American Museum of History and Culture. Anybody? Have you been? They're both astonishingly important institutions. I really recommend that you visit them. And they each tell a story, a narrative that is meant to engage you physically in the process of memory. So at the Holocaust Museum, when you enter the museum, you're conducted to an elevator, taken up to the top floor. And when you step out of the elevator, the first thing you see is a photograph of American soldiers looking down at a pile of corpses that they encountered when they arrived at a concentration camp in Europe in April of 1945. Now, what I realized when I went to that museum and saw that image was that this is the American version of that story. My version growing up, as I told you, was before I even knew what I knew that something horrible had happened to my parents in Europe that involved images and situations that I was now seeing Americans encountered and thought, oh, now we understand. But of course, there's a whole story that has to be revisited in order to understand what they were seeing for the first time. So then you work your way through the museum, finding out everything that took place that led to that moment. But it's still an American frame around a story. I think that's really important to understand, that museums, as fact-based as they can be, are framing a narrative. So what's happening now in the South, where they're talking about what should we do with Confederate statues, is a question about who gets to frame the narrative. Do we keep the statues there because they signify a civil war that really did take place in America? Well, don't we need context around them? Don't we need to know that they were defending something that we now consider to be completely abhorrent? It wasn't just, oh, the North won and the South lost. It was that they were diametrically opposed ideologies, one of which believed that you were entitled to own other people. That was a wrong ideology. So for us to say, well, there were just two different ideologies is, I think, an affront to the victims, right? So now there's this debate about what kind of structure or museum can we put these Confederate statues inside of so a fuller story gets told about who they were, what they meant, and they were on the wrong side of history, basically. So the African American Museum of History and Culture, interestingly to me, takes the other approach from this Holocaust Museum top-down descent into the past. The African American Museum starts with the past underground. You start down below in this museum and you read and enter into the centuries of the slave trade, a lot of which was based on sugar. So I'll let you think about that for a moment. Sugar, the demon. So you climb through this lower portion of the story and you work your way up through slavery in America, the Civil War, followed by Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, and finally, at the very top of the museum, in this incredible celebratory way, you get to experience the beautiful and significant contributions of African Americans to American culture. Music, dance, theater, language, fashion, everything, language, hip hop, the vernacular expressed through architecture and movement, all of which shows that the bones that lie underground have still somehow managed to produce this incredible resilience and beauty and transformation. So weirdly, I decided to start that museum at the top. I think I saw all the crowds going down and I wanted to be different and I started at the top. And I'll tell you, it was hard to leave that floor. It was so full of wonder and joy and celebration and innovation and creativity. But then I remembered that I had to see what was buried under that. I had to see what was in the soil that gave birth to that. And it reminded me that we don't just inherit the trauma of our ancestors, we inherit the resiliency of our ancestors. We inherit the perseverance of our ancestors and the will to go on and the will to create a new life in a new place, like my parents did, like maybe many of your parents or grandparents did. So I want to leave you with a couple of questions about consciousness with language, consciousness with how we use our words. So I don't know how many of you react to language the way I do, but for example, when I hear the words ethnic cleansing, the phrase ethnic cleansing, which we heard during the eruptions in Bosnia, when Yugoslavia was falling apart and the Serbs were trying to ethnically cleanse the Christians out of the Serbian-held territories, there was a big outcry about what a euphemism that phrase was. That ethnic cleansing was essentially a cover-up for genocide and mass murder. Do you remember? It's come back into our vocabulary again. The New York Times is referring to what's happening in Myanmar as ethnic cleansing. And sometimes they put quotation marks around it, and sometimes they don't. And to me, this seemingly normalized version of that phrase is saying something about how we have accepted propaganda terms into our vocabulary as if they are descriptive rather than propaganda. So chain migration is another phrase. There is debate about the use of the phrase chain migration. If you're not aware of it, look into it. The idea that people who are legally immigrated into America and want to bring family and relatives, now that phrase chain migration is being used again in a propagandistic way to hear these echoes of, I hear slavery, I hear chains of, poverty, of lower class relationships, of illegal activity, all of these evocations that this language produces, we need to question. So instead of using these phrases automatically, I recommend that we use the phrase family unification or reunification instead of chain migration. It's actually more accurate. It's equally descriptive. It's more accurately descriptive than chain migration. Instead of ethnic cleansing, genocide is the more appropriate term. Mass murder is the more appropriate term. Why do these words matter? Because they impact our ways of thinking about the world. They impact how we see one another, the assumptions we make. Do you remember when the photograph of the drowned Syrian child appeared everywhere? One of the victims of a drowning off the coast of Greece. There are millions of refugees in flight for their lives. That one photograph of a drowned child was a way of saying to people, don't forget this is happening to one person at a time. When you call people immigrants, it's different than when you call them refugees. The emotional content is really different in those two terms. Don't you feel your heart more likely to open toward a refugee than toward an immigrant who, the implication being, oh, they just are coming here because they want better opportunities? We are coming here for better opportunities. But refugee means, oh, someone who has no choice, someone who's in flight for his or her life or the life of their extended family. So language matters because it impacts how we think and feel about human lives, about human lack of choice, about humans in exile, about humans who are suffering. So for me, all of this research was a way of saying to myself, what I grew up with didn't just teach me that I was carrying a particular burden. It taught me that I have a responsibility to be empathetic toward those who suffer too, whether I know their full story or not, whether I know how many generations back the suffering goes or not, but that each individual actually has some kind of legacy of sorrow, of loss, of harm, of pain. And it may be vast, it may be on the scale of Cambodia, 1 out of 3 or 4 people in the entire country murdered by the Khmer Rouge. It might be on a smaller scale, but it doesn't matter, the scale. What matters is the personal level of identification and that willingness to say we are connected by what we carry. And we can recognize that in one another through our language, through our storytelling, through our collective forms of memory in museums or institutions, or installations like a stone placed on a sidewalk saying, this was a person who lived here and was murdered. So, if I may, before I open it up to your questions, which I really welcome and invite questions or comments, I want to leave you with an image. And it's a Japanese term and a Japanese art form that I think is, again, a beautiful metaphor for all that I've been talking about today. Kintsugi is sometimes translated as golden repair, but I've recently seen it translated as the art of embracing damage, or the art of precious scars. The art of embracing damage, the art of precious scars. So imagine a precious bowl, a piece of pottery that was handed down to you, or something you made, or something you paid a lot of money for, and it shatters. Cry, throw it away. You have a lot of choices. Replace it with a new perfect one. Kintsugi says, you fill in the cracks with gold. You repair it in such a way as to enhance and identify more fully where the bowl has been broken and how, in healing it and putting the pieces back together, you see all of its history. You see the damage it went through and is still not just whole, but in fact more beautiful than it was before. So the damage that we carry doesn't have to be looked at as loss or pain that will never go away, that we'll never heal from. But neither does it mean that we're trying to make it go away and erase it so that we never have to look at it again. The truth is, we have ongoing damage every day, all the time, to our bodies, our psyches, our culture, our truth, our story. So this image for me is so, so resonant of an option we have to hold our damage delicately, lovingly, and to let it be seen. To say, I am not only the pain and the loss that have happened to me, but I am also filled with something even more precious and more beautiful, which is the restoration of self. And ultimately, I hope an image like this is an indication of what we're capable of as human beings, that we can create a wholeness that doesn't keep repeating the separations and the murders and the hatreds, but rebuilds a culture that is based on something collective and connected and healing, I hope. So thank you for listening to me. I really hope that you'll make sure to take a book to take with you to read and consider, but I would love to know if you have any questions right now or comments. Yes?
How about, I believe when we pass away, our body returns to the dust, but the spirit persists, right? Mm-hmm. All the memories, all the experiences actually persist. Now, let me use a technical term like cloud. Imagine all those memories are safe in a cloud. Mm-hmm. And the younger generation, different generation can access that piece of information using a token, like password, from the cloud. Mm-hmm. That could explain that different generations may be able to experience the same traumatic experience, and somehow it just persists throughout the generations. What do you think about
I love it. What I think about it is that I love it. I think it's a brilliant interweaving of our technological understanding of how data is saved, and this human data, this data of memory. My father actually, who thankfully is still alive, he's going to be 89 in April, has often said to me, I wish there was a way that all of my knowledge that I've gained over all of these years of living and learning could be stored somewhere and saved so that it can be passed on. What a shame that it can't be saved. And so he's envisioning this giant brain download, But as you say, it's spirit too. It's not just what we hold in our minds and our bodies. There's something that we don't quite know what it is or how it operates. Jung talked about this too. Jung envisioned your cloud as well when he talked about the collective unconscious, and that what we carry ancestrally shows up in our dreams sometimes. I know a woman whose mother was also in a concentration camp, and this woman has dreams that when she tells her mother about them, her mother says, you dreamed something that happened to me. How is that possible, that a dream could be transmitted? Well, this is the kind of thing that I think you've just described, that it's all being stored somewhere, and that that at birth, that token that you just mentioned, our birth is our pass key to access that. Brilliantly said. Thank you for sharing that. Any other questions or comments, please? Sorry, that microphone is so far away, but...
I noticed that most of the examples you gave were like large-scale societal things like the Holocaust or slavery. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you think the same ideas you presented apply to like smaller things like individual trauma, or maybe like what I have in mind, I think like mass shootings or things like that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I think that I do in the book talk about 9/11, which of course, as a country, we thought of as happening to all of us, but we know that in actual fact, it happened to, 2 buildings in New York City and the Pentagon. We know that in theory anyway, it was a limited number of victims. But what we recognize is that the entire country does still feel the reverberations of that event. So I don't know if that's an example of what you're talking about, but I also think the Me Too movement right now is evidence of something very similar. Women and young girls who've all experienced some form of sexual assault, sexual violence, sexual abuse, one by one, individual stories begin to emerge as a wave of experience that lasted not just for generations, but millennia in a way. So the connection, I think, between the individual experience and the bigger story is present whenever there's an individual trauma. That I don't go into this in the book. Again, like I said, I had to choose what I included. But I know, for example, in the gay community, especially in the community of people who were exposed to AIDS in the 80s and 90s, that there's actually a syndrome that is referred to as AIDS survivor syndrome. That people who lived and had all of their friends die all around them, but didn't die for whatever reason. We're still trying to study why did very few people who were HIV positive not succumb to AIDS. They have this experience of, am I fortunate or am I hugely unfortunate that I've lost everyone I loved, that I witnessed everyone's death and dying all around me? So that's another example. Also, just individual experiences of a suicide in the family. That can feel certainly like an ongoing trauma in a family. And then an individual might look back at multi-generational patterns in the family and see, oh, each generation had a suicide. What does that mean? We're just starting to understand this. There's another term you might come across in addition to epigenetics. It's an acronym, ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And pediatricians and educators are starting to come up with a tool for measuring when they meet a young child and the child is acting out behaviorally in school or not wanting to go to school, or there are crazy things going on with the kid. They'll ask the kid, how many of these things, or they'll ask an adult related to the kid, how is there poverty in the home? Is there someone incarcerated in the family? Is there mental illness in the family? Is there homelessness in the family? And they calibrate and quantify these adverse childhood experiences and say a score of such and such is likely to lead to mental illness, health problems, early death. So we're trying to intervene at younger and younger ages now to recognize how even individual traumas reverberate throughout a culture and a system. Yeah, I hope does that answer your question? Thank you. Other questions?
Not so much as a question, but
a comment is more than welcome too.
yes.
Please.
So when I see that poll, what I actually see is that in the 1500s, Japan invaded Korea, and they took thousands of pottery craftsmen. Before that, most of the utensils in Japan were wood. And so when I actually see the pottery and broken, I see the history where that actually came from.
Wow.
So we only see that as a sign of reconciliation, but that itself actually has hidden sad history behind it. And when you actually mentioned Bosnia, the Serbs, when it was going on, there was a newspaper article I read a long time ago. In Serbia, there is actually a museum where one of the things that was displayed in the museum is something that looks like a tuning fork. Tuning fork has a U shape. Serbian people actually had that tuning fork because before, the Bosniaks were actually gouging the eyes of the Serbs using that fork. And so when we actually see history of genocide, it actually goes deeper. It's not just against Serbs or Bosnians. There's deep history of vicious cycle that went on. And so we don't get to see a lot of reconciliation throughout the history. My recollection of the only history of reconciliation was when I saw the recording of Nelson Mandela being interviewed after his prison release. Was one of the first things that he said was, "I forgive." And that literally, made me jump out of the chair, because that's something totally unexpected, but that actually gave hope to the future of South Africa, that Black people coming, for the lack of better terminology, Black people coming into power in South Africa wasn't going to be that bad, because here's the fighter who resisted apartheid for such a long time and put under house arrests and arrests and prison life, was coming out and saying that he actually forgave those perpetrators and he's actually willing to work with them for a better future. Unfortunately, those are rare occurrences in history. And now what I'm seeing is that I hear news about Syria, where people are dying, civilians are dying. And I hear about Yemen, where there's a proxy war going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And even in the States, I like to travel, but probably the last place I want to travel is probably Alabama, where people were actually rooting for a growing war in this present day and age.
Yeah.
And so I have 3 kids. I want to leave a better future for my kids, but at the same time, I wonder, is the world getting any better? Has history taught us any lessons? Where do we, end this vicious cycle? How can I contribute when seemingly I'm in the minority and my voices are, drowned out? Like, how do I reconcile it? And I was actually coming to the TED Talk to hear a little bit of, maybe I was hoping for some sort of a clue as to how you were able to find the clues to the reconciliation between the Germans and the Nazis.
Yeah.
And so
Well, yeah. I don't mean to cut you off. We're running out of time. I want to say you do have a voice. Your voice is really powerful in what you've just been saying. And I do think that Mandela is a beautiful example, a rare example. Forgiveness is not necessarily something that can be flipped like a switch. It's incredibly rare that somebody can even privately make a statement like that. But Germany is an amazing exemplar right now, a model country in taking responsibility for their history and preserving it even when it shows them in their worst light. And that gives me hope, right? That Germans aren't saying bygones, let it be considered history, and we are no longer obligated to remember. There was a time when Germans said that. And there are definitely still Germans who say that. So I can't speak for every German who's committed to this honest pathway. But reconciliation is a goal, and it's very difficult to achieve. And forgiveness, I don't even know if that is a goal so much as a form of justice. There's retribution and there's restoration, right? So retribution is more where people want to take revenge and see punishment meted out. And restorative justice is more a way of saying, let's at least have the truth be told. And that's where you begin. And if forgiveness eventually arises as a result, that's good, but not necessary, maybe. So the complications in Asia, the complications in Africa, there's a whole colonial legacy underneath all of that, the Tutsis were raised up by the European colonials and the Hutus were pushed down. So the Hutus had this long history of feeling dehumanized, disenfranchised. So yes, they were acting out of an old rage too. And there were massacres by Tutsis of Hutus, apparently, I'm learning now. The Armenian genocide is a long story. And Armenian genocide is a phrase you can't even say aloud in Turkey. It's illegal to say in Turkey. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. Now Poland is trying to criminalize references to the Polish participation in the Holocaust. So I think, to end on a note that's complicated, the worst of us is getting worse, and I hope that the best of us is getting better.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to stick around for a while if you want to talk. I think, is our time up? We can keep going? No, we ended a long time ago? Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ezra. Thanks, Google. Thank you all.